Hello and welcome back to yet another edition of This Week in Christian History. And we are talking today about a great thinker and someone who is maybe thinking bigger and wider than most of us might ever think any day of the week. And we're going to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas. And we are so glad to be able to have with us today Father Cuddy, who is the general editor, is that the right term, Father, of the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology. And we're going to talk about Thomas Aquinas. So thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Well, it's a great privilege to be with you in this fine venture. And yeah, like you, I share enthusiasm for Christian history, so I'm happy to be here.
I love it. Is it a is it too big of a statement to say that Aquinas really is kind of the backbone of what would be Roman Catholic theology, but then also other things that he thinks about that may not actually fit into that theological piece, but others who are not Roman Catholic could absolutely listen and understand some of the things that he opined on and thought about. That's a lot, okay? But
It,
is there some truth into all that?
I think that's a very insightful observation, which is as insightful as it is large and expansive. And so, St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, was the 13th century Dominican, the order of St. Dominic friar, Dominican friar, the order of preachers. And he was a philosopher and a theologian who covered virtually the entirety of the Christian faith, Catholic doctrine. And so, first and foremost, as you have said, he plays a pivotal role in the church's articulation of what Christians believe. And we see this enshrined, of course, in the 16th century Council of Trent. It's very
Mhm.
Thomistic, St. Thomas. We say Thomistic rather than Aquinistic after
Okay.
Thomas Aquinas.
All right.
And then the Second Vatican Council, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And so Aquinas, yes, he was important for Catholics. However, as you have also indicated, one of the fascinating things that is presently being rediscovered is how influential Thomas was, St. Thomas Aquinas, even for non Catholics.
Mhm.
So, for example, the Protestant scholastics, people like Francis Turretin, uh, and the Puritans, like John Owen,
Mhm.
they heavily relied upon St. Thomas explicitly, particularly in the debates with against between the Reformed and the Arminians,
Mhm.
the Calvinists, the Reformed, and also the Arminians, even if they didn't agree with him always. Thomas Aquinas, because of your point, was such an expansive and imposing and influential figure. He transcends denominational boundaries in many ways if you track his presence and influence in the history of Christian thought. And so I think it is accurate to say Aquinas is not only, he was a Catholic theologian, a Catholic philosopher, a Catholic thinker, but he was first and foremost a Christian thinker. And we would say
Mhm.
that that's why he was Catholic. Nonetheless, even non-Catholics, some of those who were not fans of Rome, were recognized you could abstract Aquinas's genius and holiness from a kind of a Catholic peculiarity, if we could say that.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. So it could be, hey, I really like what he's talking about in natural law or metaphysics or any other type of thing. This guy's a thinker, just like a myriad of other thinkers. I can bifurcate or trifurcate, whatever it may be, where he gets into the more of the theological things that I might not agree with, but it doesn't mean that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, for lack of a better way of saying it.
Exactly. And for your listeners, particularly on questions with regard to whether human reason, natural science can demonstrate, prove God's existence, that's where he's heavily relied upon. A recent theologian from the Protestant tradition, Norman Geisler, was
Hmm.
very famous for being a Thomist, and he wrote many brilliant books. I've read them. Whereas a Protestant, he looks at Aquinas' arguments for God's existence. We see that within history. Two other doctrines that Protestant theologians have looked to Aquinas for help upon are the doctrine of providence, how God ordains all things, all beings, and then specifically within providence, the perennially controversial question of predestination.
Hmm.
Thomas Aquinas on those three doctrines is particularly profoundly influential in the history of Protestant and Catholic thought. So, yeah.
Right. So how did let's talk about his big work, okay? I mean, I guess we would be able to talk about his I guess his primary work, right, would be the Summa Theologia, right, would be with his primary one. But give us a little background on or some thought process. If I'm a guy in what we might call the high Middle Ages, okay, I mean, how do I get to this spot that I might, it's not like I'm herding sheep or something, right? And I'm out there and these things just pop into my head necessarily. How does scholarship really kind of work in that time frame? Was it all through seminaries and through universities and through that kind of way that thoughts get kicked back around to kind of think about these things, or how do you go from Eureka to hitting the print button in our version of it?
So that's a very insightful question, and it homes in on the profundity and the innovation of the Summa Theologiae in the history of Christian thought. So, not to promote my own work, I just published
So,
an introduction to the Summa called the Summa Illuminated. It's an introduction for beginners to the Summa. And one of the things I point out there is exactly what you just said. In the 13th century, the High Middle Ages, academia, theology, and philosophy took place in two primary places. One was the university, like the University of Paris or the University of Bologna in Italy, for example.
mhm.
And at that time, universities were heavily, the church and the state were closer together. So today, a secular university would call it religion rather than theology. But in the High Middle Ages, the church and the state were more integrated, the prince and the bishop. And so theology was the hallmark, the high point of academic university instruction. It was the most elite discipline. And the way it
Mm.
worked, if you were a doctor of sacred theology, which came about through after many years of study and writing and disputation, you had three primary jobs. The first job that you did, your lectures were to deliver lectures, commentary on a book of the Bible. You were always doing that. The
Okay.
second job you had was to oversee disputations, which are a kind of debate where you'd have two basically grad students who would represent different positions before a massive audience and marshal arguments pro and con. So, for example, the question of when Christ died on Good Friday, could we say that his body was still the body of Christ because his soul was separated, or was that, did he have a body, or was it somehow related? One theologian, grad student, would say, yes, it was still his body. The other one would say, no, the dead body of Christ is no longer his body because it's only his body if it's united to him, and death is when you're separated from your body. And so the two grad students would argue, and the doctor, the professor, the master,
Mm.
after it, he would go through all of their arguments, showing their strengths, and then giving a summary of the truth of the matter.
Wow.
So that's the second thing. And then the third of three duties of the doctor of sacred theology in the university was to preach. And when we say preach, it's not like a Sunday sermon. This was like a town city event. The prince would come out, it would be packed, and he would expound upon a theme on a particular sacred liturgical day for the university community, but also for the political and secular community as well. So those are the three tasks of the university professor. And the other place that theology was done in, of course, is in the monastery. It was more
Mm.
monastic and contemplative. Now, just if, in brief, the Summa was written basically, and Aquinas says this in the prologue of the Summa, the opening introduction. He didn't think the university trifecta of lecturing on the Bible, having debates, and then preaching alone was sufficient to teach theology because he
Mm.
thought that lecturing on the Bible, of course, he revered the Bible, inspired, infallible, inerrant, but it's not an organized thing. We all know, so many people begin to read the Bible, New Year's resolution, Genesis, fine, Exodus, exciting. And then you get to Leviticus and Deuteronomy and you start saying, okay, this is a little hard going. And Thomas saw that. He also didn't think the debates, the disputations were helpful for learning theology because they're all over the place. We've all heard nerdy grad students getting excited about technical things. You can get lost. And so Aquinas is seeing his day job, what you do as a professor of theology, basically confusing or going over the heads of students. And so he says, I'm going to do something revolutionary.
Mm.
I'm going to write a book, the Summa Theologiae, that does not fit into the academic and pedagogical classroom setting now, but this would be a systematic, basic, point by point by point development that would summarize the whole of the faith. And so the point then, in conclusion, is that the Summa represents Aquinas's both indictment of the inadequacies of the pedagogical academic instruction of the High Middle Ages, as well as his proposed solution, which he knew would not be implemented probably during his lifetime, but he did it anyway. Yeah.
How about that? And so, for us non-Latin scholars, and particularly people like me that just totally hosed up the way to pronounce that, all right, we call it summa, right?
Summa, summary, yes, summa.
Summa, right?
Yep.
Say that again.
So it's Latin is weird. We would say in English theologii or
Right.
theologiae, but in Latin you say a th instead of a th like that. You say it with as if it's just a t. So summa theologiae,
How
which
about
means
that?
summary of theology. Yeah.
How about that? So it's but that's his I mean that's his opus, right? I mean that's his primary bigger work, right? I mean even though he did other things obviously as well too. I mean this is the one that, if I had to, if I was given an exam and there was a matching questions on there, I mean who wrote this or who's the guy, we're going to him, right? On the Summa.
Exactly. And what makes the Summa unique is that I like to call it, it's like a literary cathedral. We've all been to Europe or seen pictures. When you walk into a cathedral from the Middle Ages, some of the old churches, you know it's not a Walmart, you know it's not a gas station, and it pulls you upward. The very architecture is
Mm,
vertical, and each part, each alcove, each window, each doorway has a meaning which is meant to raise the soul to God. And so I think that the Summa, my argument is that the Summa's structure, where he begins, just like when you enter the cathedral in Paris, Notre Dame Cathedral, has a purpose. And then what rooms are here? What rooms are there?
mhm.
All of the parts, all of the doctrines that Aquinas treats, it's like he's a theological doctrinal architect that believes the order of examination is just as important as what you consider. And so, as in a physical monastery, an architectural or a cathedral rather, is meant to point you beyond yourself to God. So the very table of contents of the Summa Theologiae is just as important as what he says within the various sections and subsections.
How about that? So it's you don't need to get to the you don't using that analogy of the church, I mean of the actual cathedral. You don't need to be worrying about getting all the way up to the altar yet. You got a few stops along the way. And
You
and if
do.
you, and if you move a little bit quicker, some will maybe move a little quicker than others, but we got to make sure you're solid on these pieces before you can actually build on the rest of those things. Let's make sure our foundational things are right, and then let's move forward as we think more about it. Is that, or did he go, no, you can go straight to the end if you want to. That's fine. It doesn't as far as the pathway is concerned, or the structure about that. Building
Precisely. And
blocks.
some
I mean,
scholars,
okay, no,
exactly.
I mean, is that kind of like they're
Yep.
building blocks, and let's make sure you're good on block number one, okay, before we kind of move into block number two. But this is the way, there's a path to it, and there's a reason in the structure to it.
Exactly. The word path is perfect. Yes. He wants to take you from what is more clear and evident, both naturally, according to our own, what God has revealed, to what we can know about God naturally, and then supernaturally move from the most evident to the less evident. And it's true. Like we've all gone to big churches. You can go to a side chapel or to a side room that's beautiful and just sit there and pray and appreciate it. You can go to like the middle part of the Summa without going through the first part.
Mm,
But Aquinas really intended the whole table of contents and the structure, the outline, almost in invisible ink, but gloriously invisible ink to say God. That's kind of his purpose. It's a
right.
thoroughly God. Uh, it begins with God and it ends with God. God is the object, the objective of the Summa and the objective of theology. So for Aquinas, one thing some people say is that, well, Aquinas is just reading all the church fathers and all the other medieval theologians and kind of summarizing and putting them in dialogue. And I would say he does do that. He reads the fathers, he reads other theologians, but he's not a theologianologist. He's not
Mhm.
studying Augustine because of Augustine or
Mhm.
Augustine or Gregory the Great or, Bonaventure, but he's studying them because he wants to see God and he thinks they can help. So Aquinas is not just an all-purpose kind of collection of ideas and doctrines he's going to line up. No, God is the formality and the principle of unity, and the pathway is ordered to God. And so theologians are secondary in the Summa. It's God which accounts for what Aquinas does.
How about that? What a fascinating conversation we are having here with Father Cuddy to be able to talk more about St. Thomas Aquinas. Um, so, what an interesting thought. As he was writing it, thinking, hey, look, it may be a while before the full word gets out because there's probably going to be some people who are not going to appreciate the way that I've put it together or some of the thought processes, which is we need more people, as you were saying, going over too many students' heads. There might be some people that would be afraid about that because they're the guy that's supposed to be teaching you about what's going over people's heads, right? And so, was that a threat of some sorts? I don't mean physical, or I mean, but it was a concern of his, maybe that.
Sure, there's a humble boldness to Aquinas. So in the prologue, the introduction to the Summa, you can tell he knows he's writing a book, a masterful work, over a thousand, about 1,000 pages long in Latin, that's going to shake things up. He says, I'm doing it because I want to write a book that actually meets the needs of
Mm,
students.
mm,
But then he also says, he also believes that with great humility that I need God's grace. He says at the end, relying upon God's grace, this good and worthy project can become to fulfillment. That's effectively what he says, if it's God's grace. And so, one of the most revolutionary things that he does in the Summa, in the opening part, so the Summa, for your listeners, are divided into treatises, which are kind of what we would almost call topical units. But then
okay.
within each topical unit, you have a question, which are, instead of chapters, it would be like the treatise on God. You would have question one: does God exist?
Mm,
Then you have another question. If God exists, can he be knowable? And then if God is knowable, can he be exhaustively knowable? So it's the systematic process because he knows, like, even children, my nieces and nephews, even I, as a very annoying child, would always ask questions. That's just the natural human. So
sure.
the medievals use questions to shape the learning. But one of the fascinating things is that other theologians at that time had also written summas,
Hmm.
and they had argued that theology is actually about Jesus, or it's actually about the Bible, or it's actually about what God did, salvation history. And of course, St. Thomas loves Jesus. He spends, some of his most profound work is on our incarnate Lord. He loves salvation history. Some of his early lectures are outlining what God's done through covenants and the dispensations. But he says very clearly in his Summa, no, 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 no. Theology is the study of God, which
Mm,
includes Jesus and includes what he did in history. So, in many ways, Aquinas, with a humble boldness, is not correcting, but he doesn't think that those that try to say that Jesus is the only thing you study in theology or that salvation history is the only thing you study. He's kind of boldly but humbly saying, no, 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 we're about God.
mm,
And that back to your, I like that, the pathway image that you offered. It's the Godwardness of the Summa which makes it unique. And you're right. At times, people might have thought this was a little ambitious. But even today, I would say, you as a theologian, I as a theologian, many people today, even our colleagues who are professional theologians, we can ask ourselves, do we believe that the God who revealed himself to us through divine revelation, can we know him?
mm,
Or can we just approximate ideas about him? Or do we get, but the point Aquinas makes is, if God, out of his mercy and love, truly gives us divine revelation, it would be a contradiction if we didn't actually receive that, if we couldn't know it. It's like trying to throw a football pass to a guy with no arms. He said that
right.
would not be a pass. So he says, no, Thomas believed we can't exhaust, completely the divine truth. But if God reveals to us truths about himself, the sacred mysteries which are beyond our native discovery, Aquinas believes, no, no, no. You and I and all human persons can know the truth about God. So that gives him that boldness. He's not a skeptic. He's not a relativist. He's not a pluralist. He thinks maybe I'm wrong, that I, in all of my points, I haven't perfectly laid it out. He says, but I do know that there is truth and that it is knowable. That's very much at the conviction of St. Thomas. Yeah.
And why would a loving God be able to have all of this creation and I mean all this thought and knowledge about who he is, and then not allow me to even have the opportunity to get to know him and who he was, who he is, and know more about him? That would be cruel, right? Maybe
It would be cruel.
just to say, yes, you'll never get here, Junior, but I got all the knowledge. You're not getting any of it. But I mean, I've got, you're never really, really going to know me. Of course, we know we are never going to know an infinite God that is big as he is. And no matter how big our pea brains might be, right? I mean, that's not a question of that. But
And to make another observation, so if one of our friends or listeners goes home, so I'm going to check out this Aquinas, they open up the Summa and they're like, whoa, this is very using a lot of technical words and there's a lot of distinctions. It's exactly the reason why there's technical words and distinctions, parts of the Summa, parts of theology, is precisely because of what you just said, Nick. God is simple, God is infinite, God is one, and in his oneness, of course, he is three, the Trinity. We, however, are creatures, which means we are complex, which means we need steps. Like when we learn something, to learn that 2 plus 2 equals 4, we have to have it broken down. 2 apples lined up to 2 oranges, 1, 2, 3, 4. And oh, yeah. And so the reason why Aquinas, he's sometimes critiqued for having too many distinctions, but it's actually the opposite. It's because Aquinas recognized your point that the human mind is not simple, it's not infinite, it's a creature. You have to break down the simple, unified, singular truth of the eternal word of God into bite-sized steps.
yes,
And that's precisely why the scholastic, medieval Thomas Aquinas distinctions, he's trying to break down what is
mm,
in God, one and simple, into bite-sized steps that you can think through, not because God has parts or steps, but because
no.
our knowledge has to follow that in order to arrive at the God without steps or parts.
Right. And there may be some that can eat a whole mouthful, okay,
There you
or
go.
more than others. Somebody might be able to shove all of those marshmallows into their mouth at once, right? But some of us just can eat a half of one, and that's about all I can do right now,
That's
okay?
about
And
all we
so,
can do. That's
but
right.
that doesn't mean, right? It's the old, how do you eat the elephant, right? I mean, it's the old one bite at a time, right? That's the way that you would pull it.
Exactly.
So remind us, Aquinas is, where is he physically as he is doing it? Where is he teaching?
He's all over. So he was Italian. He came from an Italian middle noble family, uh, many siblings, and very quiet. Then he, as a young boy, he studied with the Benedictines at Monte Cassino, the famous, beautiful
Oh,
monastery in Italy
yeah.
with the
Up
Benedictines.
on
But he
the
became a up
Up
in the
on the
mountain,
mountain. Right,
exactly.
right.
I've driven there. It's like this. I'm like,
Have
whoa,
you
people
really?
walking. It's crazy. Like even a little car has a hard time getting up the steep mountain. It's beautiful. I love Italy. It's beautiful. And then as a young boy, he studied very humble, but his professors recognized the Benedictine monks. Okay, this is a smart kid. And the Dominican Order was just started, the Order of
Mm.
Preachers by St. Dominic. And so he joins that order. And there's some drama with his family. They didn't want him to be there. But then basically he goes to Germany to get his doctorate,
Mm.
then goes to Paris to teach. And then the Dominican Order sends him to the Dominican seminaries, the Dominican schools, the studium, the schools for us future Dominican priests in the Middle Ages. He does that in Rome and in Orvieto in Italy. Then he's back to Paris. So he was all over teaching. He really was. Yeah, and it's funny back then. People often say Aquinas was obese, like that's kind of a caricature.
Oh yeah.
But Dominicans weren't allowed. It was against the Dominican regulations from the master superior of our order at the Middle Ages to ride a horse. So when Aquinas is going all, he's walking
Oh,
thousands of miles to go from here to there to this meeting to that to teach here. And so it's interesting. You might have seen that a few years ago they did through, I think, AI, some type. They took Aquinas's skull and made like AI said this is what he'd look like. And it's a very, if you look online and say the AI, like image of what AI says from
yes.
Aquinas' skull, what he looks like, and they took some eyewitness accounts after he died of what he looked like. There's a very charming kind of attempt to say what he looked like. He was not an obese, intemperate man. This was a tall man, big boned, absent minded, and vigorous. So he
Wow.
was kind of balding. He had some like balding in the front of his head. And he was probably for at that time, very tall compared to most people. But he was walking all around the central religious and academic centers of Europe by foot.
Right. But aren't we all the beneficiary of that instead of just being at one seminary, one spot, one time and staying at one place? Uh, to be able to have this revelation of sorts, right? That, whoa, 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 we're talking over too many heads here by moving around to all of these different places and interacting with all these people and think about how many inns he had to stay in or how many somebody's home he stayed in and how many parsonages. I mean how did he where he stayed and interacted with all these folks from all these different places, all of that, you know tithe comes into the storehouse, right? I mean, in a way that it's a different, maybe it's a different learning point or a way to be able to see this. Gosh, I've been trying to explain this conversation to this innkeeper. I'm just making this up. I don't even know what I'm talking about, right? But I'm trying to, and that's helping me to understand this guy needs to know this same thing as well as my students need to know these same things.
Exactly.
And so let me summa all this, okay? And let's put it in a way
Exactly.
where we could do that.
And it's funny, you actually use that, the innkeeper. So not with St. Thomas himself, but with St. Dominic, who
Mm,
was the founder of the Dominicans. There was exactly that. He was traveling to do some preaching in the early 13th century, and he stayed at an inn. And the innkeeper was a heretic. He didn't believe that the resurrection of the body was real. He thought that the body was nothing mattered with the body. He was called a Manichaean. And Dominic stayed up all
mm.
night and converted the guy back to Christianity. And it's a famous story of the innkeeper. And that's one of the most famous stories in all of Dominican Order history. And certainly Thomas Aquinas followed that. So I know you should have been a Dominican, Nick. That's what I'm saying, because you're already thinking like us. That's one of the most famous stories. But you're right, Thomas. If Dominic took the truth of the gospel to all people, and it's typified in that meeting with the innkeeper, where Dominic stayed up all night to convince the innkeeper that Jesus is the Savior. He truly did have a body. He lived, he suffered, he died, he rose again. And the innkeeper, went to confession, had a reversion back to the faith. Um, so Thomas takes it with great, brilliant ability to unpack like an accordion, lay it all out. But to your point, Nick, he also recognized that we need something that is that is a summary. So also like an accordion, the summa can also be kind of pushed together into that
Mm.
compact summary of the faith. And so, yeah, that's exactly a very apt image.
That's fantastic. Well, maybe I can be a Thomasinian as well because I'm tall and balding. So maybe
There we
that's
go. That's right. Well, you look like
I'm already
Thomas, then
I'm
good.
already halfway there. I've
You're
been
already to
doing
be a Thomist, not just in thought, but in appearance. Good.
Fantastic. Well, tell us more about the encyclopedia. Tell us about what is the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology and where do we find it and how do I uh, uh, learn more by going there?
Well, that's kind of you to ask. So, the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology, ECT.org, is an online and in print Catholic publisher. We do media interviews, discussions with theologians. We have online articles, open access on ECT.org for
Mhm.
Encyclopedia Catholic Theology, ECT.org. And our goal is basically to provide professors and students with useful summaries of key doctrines and figures and biblical themes and books in the Christian faith.
Mhm.
And so that's what it is. So it started a couple years ago, and we are blessed to have many gifted theologians from a variety of backgrounds working on articles presently. We also have a physical series of books called the Catholic Handbook Series.
Okay.
And like with the Summa, we have these little physical, I think very attractive. Our design people are wonderful. We want to have little books like an introduction to Catholic theology. What is Catholic or Christian
Mm.
theology? What is it? What does it mean to be a theologian? We have an introduction coming out in just a couple months. We have an introduction. What is creation? We had a French theologian and philosopher write about the nature of creation. Forthcoming, We have a theoretical physicist who works at Stanford University, who was a friend and student of Carl Sagan and is testified before NASA, an astrophysicist. He converted a few years ago. He's writing a book, a little book for us about how do science and religion relate, and he's like a top scientist in the world. So, and then there's media. If you go to YouTube and type in Catholic Encyclopedia, excuse me,
Mm.
there are these videos and discussions and interviews. So, what we're trying to do is make for the 21st century in online writing, in print writing, and media, podcasts, sermons, interviews, long form interviews, uh, accessible and of discussions at varying levels about the Christian faith.
Love
It's a
it.
fresh presentation of the always true Christian faith. That's what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. Well, as we all have learned, many of us learn in different ways, right? And so when we can do that, that certainly makes a big difference as well too. So thank you so much, Father, for spending time with us today and giving us some great insight into St. Thomas Aquinas and the Summa and all of the things that help us to put together our own understanding and picture of what it means within the world of Christian history. So we appreciate that very much. Can we find copies of your
Well,
book
thank you.
as well on the encyclopedia page?
You can, but you can also get all of our books, both on from the encyclopedia and also the Summa, my book about Aquinas and my other things, all on Amazon.com. If you just type my name, Cajetan Cuddy, you'll find them. And yeah, we sell our stuff on Amazon. I know. I thought, help us to support us directly, but Amazon's so easy, it's hard.
Right. It's hard not to. That's exactly. We're looking at doing some things ourselves, and man, it's a lot easier just to be able to upload and be done, right, and not have to be
So
worried about
true.
postage, right, or anything else about that too. Well, we hope folks are enjoying this latest episode of This Week in Christian History, and we hope that you will continue to follow us on social media or be able to sign up for our newsletter to learn about events and projects and things that are forthcoming as well, and to be able to stay connected to all of that. Father, thank you again.
It's a great privilege. Thank you for all of your work.